Chapter 1. The whir of the drone's engine sounded like a giant bumblebee approaching in the sky above. It circled the park several times, observing who and what was there, anything that piqued the controller's interest, before veering off in the direction of leafy suburban streets and back gardens. Those who heard it looked up, searching, pointing and wondering what it was doing. What was it watching? Was it Big Brother? Or was it someone else, someone with an agenda all their own, someone looking for something specific and quite probably up to no good? Human reaction was always the same, the controller mused. No one ever thought it was Amazon delivering a book to some lucky person or a takeaway being delivered by a technology-savvy nearby restaurant. No, drones were always a thing to be curious about. The drone picked up height and flew back out over the huge evergreen trees to a street several rows further behind. This street was a little more upmarket than the last. Houses with big back gardens, conservatories, a place where the more wealthy folks lived. The controller could hear the whir getting further away, but from his control pad he could see exactly where he was, and it didn't take long to spot a prospective target. He let the drone hover while he studied it. There, walking along the road, was a pretty blonde, with her little treasure walking along beside her. He watched to see which house she went into and made a note of it on his phone app, adding it to the other addresses he'd found over recent weeks. This one looked a little more promising than the last one, and after Niles had given him a bollocking last night for bottom feeding rather than going for someone with a higher value, he was happy with his find. He clicked Active Track on his screen and watched the drone take over, following its target and avoiding nearby trees and power poles like it had eyes in its head. Which it did, 5 to be precise. When he'd watched her go into the house, he made a mental note to himself to come back tomorrow and double-check the location, that she wasn't visiting a friend and she did actually live there, just to be thorough. There was no room for mistakes. The controller was an important member of the group. He was the one responsible for finding the right targets and getting the details right. Being such an important cog made him feel good and wanted. They couldn't do their job quite as well without him at the controls, though Niles, the group's self-imposed leader, would never admit that he was extremely talented at it. Niles reckoned they were each easily replaceable, but Pete was anxious to fit in and keep working with them. All his life he'd been a bit of an outcast, a geek, someone who was more comfortable playing in his room surfing the web or playing games than out with his friends socializing. He had no real friends at school and never got invited to kids' parties, and that hadn't changed through his teens either. A stint in juvenile detention not exactly helping, so he'd stayed in his room by default. Then he'd met Niles and Vic, and the group gave him a purpose. He had a role to fulfill as the controller, and that made him feel like he had a place in the world, though he wished he could be as forward-thinking and in control as Niles. Still, he was happy with his lot, for now. And he loved this part they gave him, to be in control if only for a short time, out choosing targets. They knew they couldn't really do without him and the drone and the other techie stuff he could do, so they let him tag along, gave him a place in the operation, and he was grateful, and the money wasn't bad. Focusing his attention back on the little screen, he brought the drone back to the park and, before it ran out of battery life, circled round one more time to check for any other possible targets. Today he'd found a good one. Niles would be pleased, but they may as well do the other one too, the one Niles had complained about, the one he'd found yesterday, the old lady. Why discriminate? Her money was as good as anyone's, wasn't it? She'd had her own little treasure with her, and he saw no point in ignoring the opportunity. The powerful drone came back into land by his feet where he stood in a quiet spot just along from the park entrance, and he quickly put it in his backpack. Folks were always suspicious of someone with a drone, and he didn't want to cause himself a problem, so he hurriedly packed his gear away and set off back to his car to phone in and give Niles and Vic the news on what he'd found. He was sure they would be pleased with him.